everybody. Welcome to the Hallmarkies podcast. And today it's very exciting. We have a very special guest with us today. We are talking all things rom-coms, the history of rom-coms, and why they have ebbed in popularity and then hopefully are coming back. It's going to be super fun. And to do that, we are talking with the writer of a book called From Hollywood with Love that's all about rom-coms. And we're talking with Scott Meslow. And Scott, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Glad to be here.
And since this is your first time on the podcast, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you got started writing in general, but then writing this particular book?
Yeah, so I'm a film and TV critic. Written at a bunch of places. Mostly these days it's GQ and New York Magazine. And here is the book,
Yeah.
From Hollywood with Love, The Rise and Fall and Rise Again of the Romantic Comedy. Came out in February of 2021 at Valentine's Day. And that came about because I love rom-coms and wanted to go really deep, in particular on modern rom-coms. I thought there was
Mm-hmm.
there was an interesting story that I hadn't seen told the way that I wanted to tell it. So
Yeah.
I ended up here.
Yeah. Well, that's so cool. Yeah. So you've been working as a critic, a
Yeah.
film critic. Okay. So we have that in common.
hmm
Both
Plenty to
working
talk
as,
about, no question.
yes. Yeah. I was just talking about a Sundance with you off air. And so you know what it's like. That's for
I'm
sure.
very jealous here. I am not at Sundance this year. You can't tell from the window in the corner. So,
Yes. Yeah. So what, as far as your background, how did you become a critic? What was your
yeah.
story?
So I went to school at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and I
Mm-hmm.
studied English and screenwriting, and wasn't quite sure which of those tracks I would go down. So I found the one right
Mm-hmm.
in the middle. Um, from there, after I graduated, I applied to the fellowship at the Atlantic, and I got that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was generally like a magazine editor fact checker, but I knew I was kind of like really aimed at my target, and I was like, I want to do film and TV, culture criticism, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I basically just kept pitching.com until the very kind editors that were like, all right, we'll give you a shot at something. And that was, as anyone who's
Uh,
tried to make it in this field knows, like you get your one byline that you feel good about, and then you start trying to build on that. So
oh, anybody that can make it full time as a critic has my mad respect. It's very difficult.
yeah.
That's for sure. That's for sure. Well, how did you end up sort of focusing in on rom-coms?
Yeah, that was when I was in a position where I'd been writing for a while, just all across the board on film and television. So I talked to an agent, reached out to me to kind of just spitball ideas if I had any. And one thing that I zeroed in on really quickly is I want to write about genre. There are a lot of like really great books zeroing in on a specific film or TV show, or a specific celebrity, like a biography, that sort of thing. And I thought it'd be really cool to try to tell the story of a whole genre through like a series of representative examples, and then tell individual stories, but also a larger story. And when I
Uh-huh.
thought about that, rom-coms was the right answer to me pretty quickly. Like I just thought
Yeah.
there's a really cool story to be told about the modern rom-com, in terms of like all of the individual movies are interesting, and often for the predictable and frustrating reasons have not always gotten their due critically, have not always been treated as seriously as other film writers and film biographers have been, taking on dramas or take your pick.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, there was this, when I was pitching the book, it was kind of at the tail end, although it was still very prevalent, this death of the rom-com narrative that had really
Mm-hmm.
set in. And so I was like, well, there's clearly an arc here. And as I got to the end of the book, I was arguing, and I think it's since been borne out, I'm sure we'll talk about this, rom-coms were coming back, if they'd ever been gone at all, in a bigger way. So I just
Mm-hmm.
thought, here's a cool story. Like here's
Yeah.
a bunch of films I want to write about, and a genre that like has gone through sort of a phoenix from the ashes phase. And I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to try to capture that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting you say that because I sent you the one of the very first videos I ever did on YouTube.
I liked
It
it.
was way back 2014. I did a video on the death of the rom-com because that was the big thing everybody was talking about, is that and I even found articles that were talking about that, oh, it was such a cliche, people saying that it
Yeah.
was the death of, that's how much people were saying it was, it was the death
It was
of
like
the
the trend piece of
rom-com.
the month for a little while.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think it's kind of like people that bemoaned the death of the musical, and it was like, no, they've never gone away. You
They're
just
still
haven't
making
been
them
looking
every
very
year.
far.
Yeah.
It's so funny to me when people were like, La La Land is saving musicals, and it's
Right.
like, No, what I mean, we had literally just had Frozen, like, and
Right.
Moana and Sing Street that same year, you know. I mean, it's just barely.
Right.
So
When
yeah,
people
I
have a
think
certain narrative they want to tell, they can really pick specific examples and ignore other examples. And
right.
that's one
Yeah.
thing I obviously learned quickly reporting on rom-coms.
Hmm. Now, did you feel at all a little nervous about being a man writing in what is typically
Yeah.
viewed as a female space?
It was definitely something I thought about. I mostly wanted to make sure that I was approaching it sincerely, and I was pretty gratified by the response when the book actually
Hmm.
came out, and also when I was doing interviews. I could definitely like I could tell when I would reach out to people, there was very understandably a little bit of a guarded reaction because I think a lot of people, there's no sincere history of the genre without writing about like rampant Hollywood sexism. And I don't want to pretend that's gone. I would like to think it's at least moving in the right direction. But a lot of people, especially in the early movies that I reported on, were used to them being kind of dismissed as chick flicks
Hmm.
and tossed out by critics and all of the depressing, predictable things that happen with the genre. But to me, it's sort of you have to think of rom-coms as like they have been like a creative hotbed for women in an industry that is often unfriendly to them. They've certainly offered stories primarily aimed at women in a genre that is often hostile to women, or in an industry that's often hostile to women. So I think you
Hmm.
have to acknowledge and respect that. But I also think, part of what, and certainly in the selection of the films in the book, I also kind of wanted to broaden people's minds about what a rom-com is. And part of the story that was happening in rom-coms in the 30 years that I was covering was Hollywood basically figuring out how to sell rom-coms without calling them rom-coms. And guess what? It turns
Hmm.
out everyone loves them. Like it's
Yeah.
not, and I think that's much less controversial even now than it was, 2 years ago when I published the book. Like Hallmark, as you obviously know, has
Hmm.
become so explosive and such a, now it's a whole family thing. Like it's very much understood that it's
Hmm.
not.
Everyone wants to get in on the action.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that was always there. So it's, sometimes I think of this stuff as more a marketing designation than anything.
Hmm.
But yeah, I was also very aware that I was in a space that has been uniquely good for women, and I
Hmm.
wanted to honor that and make sure I was telling those stories instead of,
Hmm.
kind of interfering or intruding on a space.
Yeah.
And
Well, and
people,
I appreciate that there was no sense of like irony in the thing. Like I one of the things I hate is the we're gonna be a bunch of dudes
oh
like
God,
commenting on female stuff, you know, like I this is like
so lazy and
I hate
dismissive.
that's
Yeah, it's
that's
the worst.
so much. And
Yeah,
like because if you had the reverse and you had a bunch of women sort of commenting on the MCU or whatever, then you would get death threats. You
yeah.
you couldn't air it. You
And it
literally.
it would be horrible all like because it would also like I just think that that approach is hack in general.
Yeah.
Like if you're gonna do, and I was very understanding and sympathetic to anyone who was skeptical of me coming into the space. And my
Hmm.
only hope was that if they read the book, they would
Yeah.
understand that it was a sincere engagement. So, and,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
fortunately, that's basically the response I've gotten. So
Yeah.
people have been wonderful.
Hmm. Yeah. So you talked about what is a rom-com. And this is something
Yeah.
my friend Terry and I we do a weekly ranking episode that we've been doing the last 6 months or so, and so we've ranked classic rom-coms, we ranked rom-coms from the 60s and 70s, and then in the 80s we just posted, and we've had so many debates
Yeah.
of is this a rom-com or is this not a rom-com, I thought it would be I want to hear what your definition is, but then also I thought I'd throw out a few of the ones we debated the most and see where you
Yes.
land.
I'm always fascinated by this because the
Yeah.
number of times when I would mention to someone that I was writing a book about rom-coms and they'd be like, "Oh, my favorite's The Notebook. You've got to get that in there." Or,
Oh my
like
gosh.
I'd be like,
Yeah.
and
Uh,
you don't want to be like just when someone's excited, you don't want to be like, "Well, here's why it's not going to be in the book." But it was like things like
yeah.
that would come up all the time.
Yeah. The Notebook or Ghost I
Yes,
frequently
that comes
see,
up a
and
lot
I'm just
too.
like, are you kidding
Yeah.
me?
Right. It's not a comedy. Like it's to me, this is, but again, this is part of like how when things are a marketing definition more than anything. Like
Hmm.
when all movies made by women for women are called rom-coms, then of course people get a
Yeah.
little like the lines get a little tenuous.
Yeah.
But I can't take credit for what I actually thought was the most helpful working definition, which I have in the book, came from Donald Petrie, director of
Hmm.
many great movies, including some rom-coms, although some movies that are often misclassified as rom-coms.
Uh,
And
yes.
when I was interviewing him for the book, we were talking specifically about How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days and Miss Congeniality, and
Right.
two of his films. And
Hmm.
he he specifically talked about how the way he thinks of it is, if you pulled the love story out of this movie, would there still be a movie? And if the answer
Mm-hmm.
is yes, then it's not a rom-com. And that's why, by his definition, Miss Congeniality is not a rom-com, because still, there's a whole
Mm-hmm.
totally great love subplot in that, but it's also like a movie about an FBI agent going undercover to beauty pageant. Like, you can totally imagine that movie working just on its own terms without any love story.
Yeah.
But if you take How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, there's no, I mean, if
Yeah.
those characters aren't having that back and forth, it's like a 10-minute movie about two people who work at magazines. Like, it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to me, and then the other one, which is where the Notebook comes up, if it makes you laugh more than it makes you cry, I think
Mm-hmm.
that should be
Yeah.
a standard definition. But it gets muddled a lot.
Yeah. Well, here's a couple.
Great.
Well, what that we included The Quiet Man in our
Okay.
classics ranking.
Interesting. I have not thought about that one yet.
I think that it's clearly a comedy. The
It is a
ending
comedy.
with the fight is so
Yeah.
over the top. You can practically
Yeah.
hear the Benny Hills music. It's
Yeah.
so ridiculous. And it's definitely a romance.
Yep. Yeah, you're right. I don't think most people would like knee jerk, and despite having written the book, I still have to do like a case by case on most of the movies that I've never thought about that, but I'm on board. I agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next one that we've debated a lot, The Apartment.
Is it more of a drama? That's the question,
Yeah.
right? Like,
More of a drama. And it's really
yeah,
not that much of a romance. I
it
mean, you could
always gets called a rom-com.
at the very yeah, it does. And at the very end, like I mean,
Yeah.
it's almost more of a workplace sort of
Yeah.
comedy, maybe. I don't know. It's barely a comedy.
The comedy's the thing that trips me up. I think I wouldn't like get mad at someone who called it their favorite rom-com or put it on the list, but I think it would fall off my list. Like, it's just on the other side of the fence.
Yeah. Breakfast at Tiffany's. So we had some debate.
I think that's a rom-com. It's,
Okay.
again, it straddles that comedy drama line in a way that but I think when you look at the ending, which, not that all rom-coms need to end in couples getting together, not even the ones in my book do. But I think it's such a rom-com type ending to me in your classic sense that I think it tips over, especially changing it from the novella, which has the opposite bummer ending. Like, that to me makes it feel a little more traditional genre.
Well, another one we were just debating yesterday is The Birdcage. What do you think?
Wow.
Definitely a comedy, but
Yeah,
it's all about a wedding.
Yeah, but is that the central thrust of or do we look at that as like the circumstances in which the plot is on? Like, the love story's already kind of been told. I would say no.
What about Before Sunrise?
No, it's a drama, romantic drama.
You think it's a drama?
I do.
Okay.
There's funny scenes in it, but obviously maybe, I mean, Sunset might be the most romantic movie of all time, full stop to me. But I think of them all as dramas, and I think the sequels only make that clearer. So that's where I'd put it.
We should have you as our like emergency hotline.
Sure. Yeah. I'll be your
when we're having
anytime.
these debates.
Yeah. I don't claim to be the final word, but I'm happy to weigh in.
Yeah. Okay, good. Good. And Legally Blonde. You say
not a
no?
rom-com.
It's not.
Comedy with a romantic subplot.
Okay.
And I have gotten heat for that not being in the book, and that's my defense.
Okay. Yeah, agree. What about Mean Girls? I would say no.
No. Teen comedy.
Yeah. It's packaged like a rom-com.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the tricky thing.
That's the other thing. You like, people have an idea of rom-coms based on like the posters. There are certain aesthetic choices that like can tip you over. But to me, like, I mean, the romantic subplot is barely even, is that like the fourth most important plot in that movie?
No. I mean, yeah, it's barely. And then you have movies like The Apartment or 500 Days of Summer, which by publishing standards would not be considered romances because of the endings.
Right. Even though, I mean, to me, and something I had to figure out when I was writing the book, one of the chapters is on my best friend's wedding. He pointedly does not end up with her with a partner. And so,
and I guess in fairness to 500 Days of Summer, it says at the very beginning of the movie, this is not a romance.
Yes, that's true too. So I guess if the movie is going to define itself, it's hard to argue with the movie. Although I might quibble. I don't know. I'd have to think about it.
Yeah.
Ho, ho, ho. We'd like to take a second and thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. It's the Hallmarkies Patreon.
Do you love Hallmarkies podcast, especially at Christmas?
Do you enjoy the holiday previews, recaps, interviews, and bonus episodes?
If the answer is yes, please consider supporting the Hallmarkies Patreon. We need your help to do what we do both during the Christmas season and all year round.
But not only do you help a podcast led by strong, independent women by becoming a Patreon, you get to become a part of the Hallmarkies family.
Starting at only $2 a month as a patron, you will have access to our Facebook Patreon group where we talk about the movies, shows, and more all year.
We also have many monthly patron watch-alongs with guests like Lacey Chabert, Natalie Hall, Paul Campbell, Mary Lou Henner, and more, giving their behind-the-scenes details of their films.
As a patron, you also have the chance to provide input into the podcast and even join us at different tiers.
So this Christmas season, spread some cheer to the Hallmarkies Patreon and become a member today. You won't regret it.
Go to patreon.com/hallmarkies to learn more.
That's patreon.com/Hallmarkies.
You started the book in 1989 with When Harry Met Sally. And what was your strategy behind that? Behind picking that date?
There were a few reasons for it. The most boring answer is the practical one. You know, I wanted this book to be whenever possible, like an actual history where I could actually report it out, talk to, you know, writers, directors, actors, everyone you'd expect, anyone involved in the production. And even starting there, like I didn't have Nora Ephron. It was just, you go back to the 70s and it gets harder and harder to report these stories. And so that was just
our 60s and 70s ranking. It was it was rough. There were I have to say, I know that a lot of cinephiles love the 70s. It's for my interest because I love animation and I love romantic comedies. It's not the best time period.
A little more dour just in
either
general.
of those, you know, not a ton of animation or romances, but yeah, it was a very strange list of got like Harold and Maude and, you know, stuff.
I think there are great movies in there. I think it just would have literally been hard to report. But I also, when I was thinking about it, because, you know, to write a book like this, I had to figure out my starting point, and I probably made a list of like 70 or 80 different movies that could be potential chapters. Like, it took a while to whittle it down.
Yeah.
But I pretty quickly zeroed in on When Harry Met Sally as the start, because it felt to me like the prototypical like 90s rom-com, even though it's 89. Like, I think it set the tone for what I think of as the modern rom-com, certainly for the boom in the 90s and 2000s, both in what it was doing and in like the people who made it. You know, between it being, you know, Nora Ephron kind of making her big rom-com debut and Meg Ryan being, you know, the America's Sweetheart, like all of the stuff about it felt like here is the logical starting point that everything sort of followed from in this era of the genre.
Do you think that if they were to do When Harry Met Sally today, that they would have a different ending? I feel like we'd be a little braver now, because the whole thing about, I mean, I like the movie. I really, and I even like the ending, but I just feel like the whole thing of, can men and women be friends?
Right.
And the answer to the question is that no, they can't.
Yeah.
By the movie, which
if you take the movie at its word,
which of course they would disagree with, because they were good friends, Robin and Nora. And so I think that if it were going to happen again today, I think they would have the more bittersweet 500 Days of Summer kind of ending. And
I cover this in the book, but that is how the movie originally ended. This is one of the more interesting parts of the story to me.
Yeah.
You know, literally, Rob Reiner had, you know, they'd written with Nora Ephron the much more wistful ending where they decide they shouldn't really, you know, they hook up, but they decide they won't be together, and they like bump into each other on the street. It's very, I mean, that movie has a lot in common with Annie Hall. It's a very Annie Hall type ending where it's more of like a wistful, like, you know, oh, like we meant a lot to each other, but they have other partners, and they're just like, oh, it's nice to see you again. And then he like fell in love and got married while they were making the movie, and then they came up with the big happy rom-com ending, which to my mind, even though I agree with you, it's sort of like, I'm not great with like the underpinnings of what it's saying in terms of like men and women can't be friends. I don't think that's a great argument for a movie to be making. But I do think it's about as perfect and sublime a rom-com ending. Yeah, it's so swoony. It's so everything that every other rom-com in that vein tried to do and never did it quite as well. The speech and the run through the streets and all that. Yeah. It was interesting. I interviewed Michael Litwack, who did this really cute little movie called Molly and Max in the Future, which is coming out. I saw it at South by Southwest last year, and I loved it. And it is a riff on When Harry Met Sally. And so I was talking to him, and I said,
well, does your movie ask a question? He was like, the thing about the question in When Harry Met Sally is it's a stupid question.
Yeah.
I
Right.
was like, that's so true. Of course, men and women can be friends.
Yeah.
Like, it's ridiculous.
I do feel like
But
that's
at the
asked and answered.
time, it was more, I think, kind of relevant. Like, it was just a
Yeah,
different, it was a different era of like gender politics, I think, than
totally.
now.
But
Hopefully.
that's also like, as much as I don't think the movie's ever seriously engaging with that question either. Like as much as that's a great like thing to describe the movie, it's more the movie's about, can this man and this woman be friends? And the answer is like, no, they should be together, obviously. Like, and the movie, I do think that's clear in their connection, even if they're both kind of slow to realize it. Like I don't think the movie needs to be taken as a universal. I think Harry and Sally belong together.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that we've gotten a true replacement for Nora Ephron since she passed. And people sometimes put Nancy Meyers on that same level. Not this person. I don't think that she is nearly as the writer that Nora Ephron was. And I think that's part of the reason why the genre slumped for a while,
It
is
doesn't
there
have its
just
godmother.
hasn't. Yeah.
I also
There
think
just hasn't been.
I love Nancy Meyers too. I just think she's doing different things. Like I think the
Yeah.
goals are fundamentally different. We don't have someone who's doing, aiming exactly for what Nora Ephron was aiming for. And also like,
Yeah.
you're not wrong. She was a singular talent. That
Yeah.
there was something she was able to do.
I've been frustrated by some of Nancy Meyers' films, particularly like The Intern really annoyed
Sure.
me. That I was
That's
just
my
like,
thing.
how is she blaming the female character in this movie for
Right.
her husband being an idiot? Like, I don't know, that just really annoyed me, that like she was somehow culpable for her husband's philandering, which I was just like, no, you're not.
Yeah, no,
Because
I
you
have
were
problem. I
at
have
work a
problems.
lot. Like, that's an
Yeah,
excuse.
right. It does feel a little backwards and regressive.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think her better movies. I mean, I love Something's Gotta Give. I love The
Yeah.
Holiday.
Yeah.
I,
You have a chapter on Something's Gotta Give.
I do. Yeah, I think that's an
Yeah.
important
Hmm.
one.
Yeah. So what would you say maybe are some favorites that, because you started in 1989, that you couldn't include in the book? Do you have classic
Yeah, the one that
favorites?
was really painful, and then I've gotten like, if you're watching this and you're annoyed that I started in 1989 because it doesn't include Moonstruck, like you're totally right. Like I also wish Moonstruck was in the book. It's great.
Hmm.
I it just didn't fit it. I was the other thing is I sold the book in
Hmm.
2019, and so it was like a 30-year scheme was a really like,
Hmm.
we're gonna do 2019 to like it just all
Hmm.
adds up to start in 1989. But I love Moonstruck. It's painful it's not in there. It's an
Hmm.
incredible film.
Hmm.
It's I mean, the stuff that I think about when I really like is stuff that just would have been impossible. Like certainly maybe my favorite rom-com full stop. I can't pin it down because I've watched too many now. But like I love His Girl Friday so much. It would have been
Hmm.
literally impossible to report it. But like
Yeah.
to
That's a great
do
one.
to do like a whole survey of the genre would just be a totally different book than the one I was doing.
Hmm.
And so like, or like Bringing Up Baby, like all of these like
Hmm.
beloved classics for a reason belong in
Hmm.
a book, but like I couldn't have talked to any of the
Hmm.
people who made them. And so
Right.
it wouldn't have fit what I was doing. But it is like, I love reading other people's writing about rom-coms because I really had, once I picked my window, like I had to laser in, but there is so much to say that was just out of the scope of what I was doing.
Yeah. Christmas in Connecticut. That's one of my
Yep,
favorites.
that's great.
Yeah, that's
It's
one of my favorites.
so many Philadelphia Story. Like you can
Hmm.
just any of the like the 50s, like the all of that, like the desk set and like
Hmm.
that stuff is so like I would love to like I mean I've read plenty of books about rom-coms while I was reporting the book, but now that I've like it's been a couple years since my book came out, and so I think I went on a rom-com detox for a little bit once the book came out because I was just like, wow, I've been in here for a while. And now I'm kind
Yeah.
of ready to like see what's been written since the book came out. So I kind
Hmm.
of need to go in and see what else has come out lately.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do you think that the rom-com died? In as
Yeah.
much as it, at least as far as feature films, they just weren't making them for a while,
Yeah, I
or
think
many of
that's
them.
this is sort of where I give the lie of the subtitle of my book because it's the rise and fall and rise again of the romantic comedy.
Uh-huh.
But I actually think of it more as like the decline of the mid-budget studio film.
Yeah.
I think rom-coms uniquely devalued as they always were sort of uniquely devalued by the Hollywood studios at a time when the whole, like, there was a larger sea change happening in the industry. And of course, it was kind of unfairly, it became a death of the rom-com story. But what was really happening was like any film made at a medium budget was sort of getting pushed down the list, and it was all,
Mhm.
here's a $200 million Spider-Man movie that might make $1 billion, or like, we're going to give Martin Scorsese $10 million and maybe we'll win Best Picture, like, or whatever, like,
Mhm.
it's something. Those were sort of like, as we were watching the bottom file out of the middle class of films, basically. Like, what happened was rom-coms were sort of like, they ended up in a no man's land where it was like they would make money, but they wouldn't make $1 billion. And there was this often untrue, but it would still very like commonly repeated piece of wisdom that they didn't travel. So that like, you didn't necessarily, as the worldwide grosses were getting more important, there was this argument, even though if you look at the box office numbers, it's often not true, that these movies did well, they did well with American audiences, but didn't necessarily work elsewhere. And so, and because again, unfair things, rom-coms are typically not serious awards contenders. And so, unless I should hasten to note, they said to the protagonist of a white straight male character, they are suddenly taken a little more seriously. And Silver Linings Playbook is up for Best Picture, or Four Weddings and a Funeral, or take your pick. I
Mhm.
I don't think I need to draw a map for why that happened.
Right.
But
Yeah.
but it meant that it was like rom-coms weren't really serving either of the priorities of that given moment. And at the same, like, I think also some of the trends that were happening were sort of good. Like, for a while, part of the reason rom-coms would get made is that there were stars who would make them and make nothing else, because it was very difficult for actors and actresses in particular to move like in and out of the genre. Like, Meg Ryan got pigeonholed for a long time, probably most
Mhm.
famously. Whereas, we were in an era where like Emma Stone could do a Spider-Man, and then she could do a Crazy Stupid Love, and then she could do La La Land and win Best Actress. Like, all of those things could happen in a much more compressed timeline. And so it was like, you didn't really have your torchbearer for the whole genre, except for maybe Katherine Heigl was sort of the one who was prioritizing them. But a few of those movies didn't hit in a row, and there you go.
It's true. And we were just saying the other day, we're like, Sandy, come back to us. You've got your
Mm-hmm.
Oscar. You got Bird Box. You've done your
You
dramas.
got the
Please
Lost
come
City
back to
last
us,
year.
please.
Lost City is an action
Yeah.
rom-com. It's at least in the ballpark.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that Hollywood just stopped making movies for women,
Yeah.
And everything had to appeal to 17-year-old boys in one way or another, and so you just hardly got any dramas or comedies for women. And I mean, that's what made what Hallmark did was so brilliant, is they swooped in and they were like, okay,
Yeah.
we'll make lots of good stuff, fun stuff for women. And I think it's why right around 2014 is when Countdown to Christmas really took off and become an institution. And it kind of, I think it reached its peak as far as viewership around 2016.
Mhm.
And because there just was nowhere else. Like, if you liked
Yeah.
romantic comedies, you had to be a Hallmark fan.
Yeah. No, that
That
was
was it.
certainly in terms of the kind of classically structured. And I think the other
Yeah.
important part of the story is streaming. Streaming got in on rom-coms in a big way, probably 3 or 4 years later.
Mhm.
Than the era you're talking, like everyone. I think there was sort of this dawning realization, starting with Hallmark, that like there was a very underserved market there.
Yeah.
Certainly when the screenwriters I talked to who had written rom-coms that had ended up selling streaming as I was reporting the book, like those people, amazing how many people repeated the story to me, basically, of like having written a rom-com they were excited about, no one wanted to read it, sat on the shelf for 8-10 years, and then suddenly like Netflix is interested, and they look at it on Friday and they say, we'll have an answer for you next week, and like stuff ends up in production. Like there was this very sudden like, oh yeah, like, why aren't we making these movies anymore? The
Yeah,
incentives are a little different,
because
but
even the feature film rom-coms that were being made during that time had mostly a masculine energy to them.
yeah,
You know,
no, there was
your Judd Apatows and your things like that. That and there's nothing wrong with those. It just, movies just weren't being made for women in the 2010s. It was rough.
yeah, no, it was a very, I think that was a pretty weird time for Hollywood in general.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what era we're entering now, because I don't think the superhero stuff has bottomed out or anything, but it's certainly not the only game in town
Yeah.
anymore. there clearly
Yes.
needs to be a different answer.
Right. We'd like to take a second and thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. It's Baker Bookhouse and their spring releases. First, The Seamstress of Acadia by Laura France. Caught between the warring French and English on Canada's rugged shores in 1755, Sylvie Gallant is forced from her Acadian home and family and is alone in colonial Virginia. Now, the enemy soldier who once tore her world apart might be the key to restoring her shattered past. Next, The Irish Matchmaker by Jennifer Dybel. Catriona Daly is no stranger to the business of love, even though personally she has yet to find it. Eager for a match of her own and a fresh start away from her sleepy village, she makes grand plans for the annual Lisdorvarna matchmaking festival. She never expects, however, a shy, widowed sheep farmer to distract her from her goal. To get ready for summer, we have Just for the Summer by Melody Carlson. Ginny Masters manages a Seattle boutique hotel but is tired of the rat race. Jacqueline Bowman manages her grandfather's fishing lodge in Western Washington, but she longs for city life. Eager for a change, these women swap jobs for the summer, but it's not quite so simple to find the happiness and love they're searching for. And finally, Sandkissel Inn by Irene Hannon. When a man struggling to recoup from a tragic loss and woman still reeling from an unplanned career detour join forces to save a floundering B&B on the Oregon coast, they might also discover that hope and healing can sometimes be found in the most unexpected places. You can pick up any of these books wherever books are sold now or later this spring and save up to 40% off on these or the whole spring book release list at bakerbookhouse.com/featured/rebel-fiction or use the affiliate link below. That's bakerbookhouse.com/featured/rebel-fiction.
I think anyone's quite figured it out, but I'm sort of heartened by what I'm seeing in rom-coms. Like anyone but you, huge sleeper hit. It's
yeah, it made me so happy, even though I thought the movie wasn't that great, but it made me happy to see it do well.
Well, even just watching a movie leg out again, like a movie could open low and then like week after week, like word of it, like this is how it used to work. Like we're doing it again. It's great.
Yeah. Yeah. So you did your own research and interviews for the book. Yeah. So how was that whole process? Getting in contact with these people and
very difficult.
Yeah, I bet.
Because I'm really happy with how the book came out. In retrospect, I had sort of underestimated the difficulty of like, there's 16 films in the book that I cover in detail, and dozens more kind of mentioned obliquely. But like, that meant I was doing 16 oral histories, which meant every chapter I was starting fresh every time, where I was like doing my ask to all of the people who I thought would have a relevant perspective on the movie. And like, if you pick a single subject, like all of your chapters can have the same sources to a degree. Here it was a big mountain to climb. People were so generous with their time, though. People were the really fun part was when I would go to people and like, once we started talking, it was like, it became clear that they'd never really been asked about these movies in a serious way before. And we're so excited to finally like tell some of these stories and, go behind the scenes of the production. It was just the way that this genre has been treated for a long time.
Yeah.
And not by its fans, but by like journalists. And so I was kind of shocked by how much unreported gold there was. It was just kind of there for the taking. Yeah.
Was there something or one of the movies or just something you learned that surprised you the most?
Yeah. That's a good question. I knew some of what had gone on with Pretty Woman had been reported.
Yeah.
I'd never heard the whole, I don't think the whole story had ever really come out. Like everything that happened with that movie, like how it transformed from this like super dark and gritty Sundance darling to this like, this very prototypical rom-com at this point. I mean, the whole way that movie, is a very late addition to it is that they weave in all that fairy tale stuff and kind of explicitly draw that parallel and set it like, I just find that movie so fascinating because you can still see the seeds of how dark it was. And then, but it so didn't play that way. And then it became the biggest rom-com in history. It's like, it's just this, everything about that story is so insane. Like it's it's such an unrepeatable experiment that a movie that like probably would have been even too dark for a serious studio release became what is, thought of, I think kind of incorrectly, but still often thought of as like this very cotton candy rom-com. it's Dad's story and talking to people everyone who was involved with that, who was still with us. Gary Marshall, unfortunately, had passed by the time I was reporting the book, but talking to the other people who were involved in that, really just such a transformative process for that film.
Yeah, I had written down the Pretty Women evolution was
It's
very
so
interesting
crazy.
to see.
Yeah.
And it was so brilliant of them to tie that to basically make it Cinderella.
Yeah.
The 90s version of Cinderella. Brilliant.
There were so many uncredited writers on that movie
Yeah.
who like kind of found those through lines that weren't necessarily there in the original script. It's like movie, it would just never happen. Like even though uncredited screenwriters are still everywhere in Hollywood, but like a film would never evolve the way that one evolved. You just never happen now. So it's really like a special story from a strange time in Hollywood history.
What I found fascinating was for each of the movies, if it didn't have a sequel, you talked about the attempt to make a sequel, and that's the case with Pretty Women. And I just thought that was interesting how many of the attempt, like to hear what the attempts at sequels were and how they fell apart.
Yeah, there are so many, and it's the anecdote that I really loved from that. I talked to the writer on the movie, and he kind of talked about how people would approach him all the time asking about a sequel, and he was finally like, "Well, what would it be about?" And it's just that, I don't know. I just want to see them being happy, and I just thought that was so sweet.
Yeah, well, see, that's the problem. People always do that with Hallmark movies. They're like, "Oh, we want a sequel to this great movie," and I'm like, "No, no sequels," because the sequels are horrible almost always. Because you have two choices: you can either have the couple get married or have a baby, or you have them break up. And both of them suck.
Bridget Jones did both.
Yeah. I hate the second Bridget Jones, although I thought it was very interesting that it was somehow based on Persuasion. That was an interesting tidbit.
That's a misbegotten movie, and I think everyone's pretty familiar. I'm a fan of Bridget Jones's Baby. I think that's a pretty good movie.
I agree. I like the third one. I enjoyed it, and that was that was one of the first movies I covered as far as press. And I had to drive an hour to this. They never do screenings in Layton, which was like an hour from my house. But I was like, I'm making this screening if it kills me.
Yeah. I think it was worth it. That is a worthy rom-com sequel. If people watching this haven't visited them recently, give it another look. I think it's a solid movie.
But yeah, they have them break up, and then that sucks. Like there's this popular Hallmark movie called the 9 Lives of Christmas.
I've seen that one.
Yeah, it's pretty cute.
I saw that in theaters over Christmas.
Oh yeah,
it did a special screening out here, and I took my mom.
Oh really?
Birthday. Yeah.
And they did a sequel to it, and it was okay. It was certainly like one of the better. But they have them break up.
Yeah, that is a bummer.
You're like,
I did look up the sequel after out of curiosity, and as soon as I saw it was a breakup, I was like, I don't need it. I'm good.
Yeah, it's the worst.
We'd like to take a second and thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. It's the Hallmarkies merch store.
Are you looking for that perfect gift for the postable, Hardy, or Hallmarky in your life?
What about getting that t-shirt or hoodie that will help you stand out at your next holiday party?
Now is the time to check out the Hallmarkies merch store.
Full of festive designs by artists like Jessica Miller, Carrie from Hallmark Comics, and more.
You can even have more than just shirts, but totes, cell phone cases, notebooks, mugs, and more.
And it isn't just Hallmark. We have designs for Anna Green Gables, Man from Snowy River, The Nanny, and more.
Every purchase at the merch store goes to help support the podcast and allows us to make the great content you know and love.
There are frequent sales, so go to tpublic.com/stores/Hallmarkies or see the link in the description.
That's tpublic.com/stores/Hallmarkies.
I was surprised that you picked Waiting to Exhale. I would not have thought of that.
Yes, and I've gotten some pushback on that, and I do get why. But I'm really happy that it's in the book, and I'm happy with the placement of it. Like, it was something I thought about a lot.
I would have thought of like The Best Man.
Yes, which I thought about too.
It's more of a rom-com.
Part of why I really zeroed in on rom-com there, and I get that one definitely straddles the line. Like there's totally an argument that it doesn't qualify as a rom-com, although I would disagree. But when I really locked in on that was when I talked to Terry McMillan about it. And she was the novelist who, the film is based on, for people who don't know that, but she was so thoughtful and eloquent about how she was deliberately channeling rom-com tropes and then subverting them. Like, she really knew the genre. And I thought that, especially, so this is the fourth chapter in the book. It comes after When Harry Met Sally, Pretty Woman, and Four Weddings and a Funeral, which are all like great and worthy movies, but also like they're the movies you expect, right? Like though, if you were writing a book about rom-com starting in 1989, like those are the three movies.
Yeah.
And I thought it was like the right time in the book, both the cover that like Hollywood basically ignoring all of the evidence that there's like a huge audience for rom-coms about non-white people.
Mhm.
And I wanted to cover that era in a way, and that was, I mean, it was a huge hit that was like, of course, immediately ignored. And, other than they adapted How Stella Got Her Groove Back, they didn't really come up with it didn't spark the trend that I felt like it should have.
Mm.
But I also felt like it was the right time in the book to sort of try to expand people's ideas of what a rom-com might be, and what rom-coms I might be covering in the book. And that to me felt like the right movie at the right time to sort of explore that story. And also, a movie that's as much about female friendship as it is about the romances in it. That to me, and how much like Sex and the City basically lifted from it more or less directly. There was so much that I just sort of wanted to get into with that movie that I think was representative of broader trends in rom-com storytelling. And so I was really happy it was in there. But I do get why it would stick out to some people.
Yeah, because most of the romances are not like
They're not
positive
very happy.
in it.
There's happy and unhappy in there, which is part of what I like about the movie. There's some very sweet romances too, but certainly part of it is like, there's a reason the Angela Bassett car burning scene is like the most iconic scene in the movie. Like it's
right.
It's also a story about scorn, but I think there's room for that in rom-coms too. So
cool. Okay. So the most controversial statement in your book.
Where we go.
I can believe that you said that How Do You Know is the best Reese Witherspoon rom-com.
Okay. I do need to defend. I understand. I guess I'll loop back to first qualify again. Legally Blonde, not a rom-com. Doesn't fit under my parameters. Here's where I admit I am not a big fan of Sweet Home Alabama. I know that's a controversial statement. I'm sorry. If that makes you
do I need to
disavow the book,
revisit this? Because I haven't seen it in a long time, but I was not a fan when it came out.
Not a favorite of mine. And I mean, then what else? Just Like Heaven. This Means War. Your Place or Mine.
Ooh,
like
This Means War. No.
Yeah, like see, she's
Place or Mine was terrible.
Star, but like it's if Legally Blonde isn't a if you're willing to accept my premise, then the better one.
I mean, I do enjoy Sweet Home Alabama, but fair enough. If you don't like that one, I guess I can kind of see.
And I know,
although I do also like Just Like Heaven especially when he's like, one day I'm going to need to bury a body, and you're going to have to help me.
Yeah. I mean, that one's not bad. I do find the twist a little like it was a twist that went the opposite direction for me. Where as soon as we find, I don't know, should I spoil movies on this, or people might not?
You're fine.
Okay. Yeah. When it turns out that she's in a coma, like that to me was like, I'm less interested in this movie now. That makes it less interesting to me. And so it's sort of, but I'm probably being a little unfair to that movie because Mark Ruffalo's great. And like, there's plenty to like about that movie. I think I also find, How Do You Know, like such an interesting movie. This might be where I was wearing my like critic scholar hat a little more than my like rom-com fan hat, where I was just like, it's the most expensive rom-com of all time. It's like Brooks's big return to the genre. It's got all these interesting actors, and it's undeniably an idiosyncratic movie. Like there's no one would have made that movie that way except for him. And like I think it's really like
I was listening to as I drove to back and forth to Sundance, and I was like, did you say that?
Yeah. I get that reaction. I will. This is my argument for it. You can totally throw it out the window and throw the book out the window if you're like, he's an idiot. That is a terrible opinion. I get that. I get that completely. But I would also say that movie's on Netflix right now.
I haven't seen it since it came out, so I'll have to revisit it.
You're not gonna love it now. I'm not arguing that it's a lost classic, but I do think it is interesting in such strange ways, and it's a worthy movie to look at just on those terms.
Fair enough. Okay. What do you think about the Christmas rom-com? Why do you think that Christmas, because a friend of mine I was talking to about it, and he was like, what's romantic about Christmas? It's it's about baby game where like it's for kids, like it's a kids holiday. Why? And I'm like, I don't know, it's cozy.
Yep.
Like cold outside. Like, I
Yep.
don't know, give people presents.
Yeah.
What do
I
you
mean, I think
think
there's no
about
question
it?
that's part of it.
Yeah.
It's aesthetics, right? Like if
Mhm.
rom-coms are selling a fantasy, of course it's like snow and lights and cheery and
Yeah.
bright color. Like it's all, and there's sort of a natural like building any rom-com around a holiday. So many people copped this when Love Actually did it. Like it's so,
Mhm.
it gives you kind of a natural ballast. It's like that was basically Gary Marshall's late career. It was like
Mhm.
Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, New Year's Day. Like it just sort of, it gives you an excuse to unite a bunch of kind of disparate stories that would otherwise
Mhm.
not necessarily go together, like in a way that like is immediately comprehensible if you see it on a movie poster.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think it's warmth, togetherness, the things you'd expect.
Mhm.
It's a time of good cheer, so why not like throw romance into the mix?
Yeah. Yeah.
It just
And
sort
it
of lends
really
it.
did start early on,
Oh yeah,
Holiday Affair,
yep.
Christmas in Connecticut, Miracle on 34th Street.
Like
All, I think, could
Christmas,
be all
all
considered
these,
rom-coms.
yeah. So it was recognized early on, but I think that's sort of like it's a good little screenwriter's cheat code to be like, here's a happy time of year. I'm going to do my happy
Mhm.
story then. Like I totally get I get it. It's just like a mercenary move. And also,
Mhm.
if it works, then everyone's going to watch it every year. And then,
Mhm.
like Love Actually is a perennial movie now,
Mhm. Yeah.
or I guess annual, not perennial. Like it's
Mhm.
every year it gets a lift and they put it in theaters again. And like
Mhm.
that's not a bad deal if you're the one who pulls off the one that sort of corners the market on that.
Mhm. Mhm. And so if you were going to do a chapter on Hallmark, what role do you think it has played
It's
in the
hugely
genre?
important. I think you pinned it down exactly in terms of like it was like the canary in the coal mine for what was missing. It was like the
Mhm.
first, you know, I did think about doing Hallmark or something on TV, but it felt like it moved me away from. I did some streaming, but it felt like
Mhm.
the big thing, and again, so much of the decisions about the book were about the structure, because each chapter is focusing on an individual movie that's representative of a larger trend. And I
Mhm.
couldn't figure out what the representative Hallmark movie was. You're probably the person I should have asked. 'Cause I didn't, I looked at a bunch. I watched so many rom-coms that didn't make it into the book. So I looked at a bunch and it was just like,
Yeah.
I don't know if any of these is the prototype. Like, do you go with the first
Mhm.
one that really, like, it just sort of, you start to
I
kind
probably
of,
would go with the Nine Lives of Christmas. That one is like
which I thought was
universally beloved.
yes, and
Yeah.
super charming, and there's like good leads. It's interesting. It's spawned a
Mhm.
sequel. There's plenty to
Mhm.
say about it.
Mhm.
But it felt like it moved me to a little too far afield of like
Yeah.
from what I was doing. But I at least tried to cover. I have sidebars in the
Yeah.
book too, and I at least tried to cover like some of what was happening on TV at the same time because I
Mhm.
did think that was an important part of the story.
Yeah. So, do you have a favorite of the main tropes? Your friends to lovers, enemies to lovers, fake
Oh, totally.
fiance, that kind of thing.
I am an enemies to lovers guy. I like,
Mm.
if we're gonna go all the way back to the history of rom-coms, like, and I guess they go back to the Greeks, so like how far back can we really go? If we're gonna look at Shakespeare, like I'm a
Mhm.
much ado about nothing guy. Like
Mhm.
I want the bickering that turns into love, but I love that dynamic. I love His Girl Friday. Like I like a spiky, repartee. Like that to
It's
me is
very
the easiest way
difficult.
to lock me into it. It is. Very
It's
few people do
very,
well.
very people don't realize, but you
Yep.
have to make that switch
Yeah,
happen just at the right time because if it takes
totally.
too long, then we just hate everybody and we don't care.
Yes. And they need to be each other's equals. So like
Hmm.
you can't write either
Yeah, that's
character
true.
both in their backgrounds, in their personalities, or in their dialogue as superior to the other. Like the one upsmanship needs to be constant, and
Hmm.
like it needs to be like tennis where they're just batting it back and forth. Like
Yeah.
saying that for 90 minutes, got to be a pretty good writer. But when it works, I'm totally in.
Hmm. So you have chapters on the best friend and the other guy.
Mhm.
And how do you think that those roles have evolved over the years?
Yeah, that's I think if you're talking broad trends, so those are such archetypal characters. The best friend who's there's Judy Greer, who's the one I mostly cover in that book, has that great, I think it was a Funny or Die video where she basically like you see that she's just like a totally empty vessel who's just not doing anything when her friend's not around, and she's like making fun of these like very thankless
Yeah.
women rom-coms at the time. And it's if you haven't looked this up or seen it before, it's really funny. Check it out. Really,
Hmm.
it kind of pins that trope to the wall. And the other guy, the guy who gets left at the altar, I think that's just such a uniquely. I always think of Walter in Sleepless in Seattle as like the
Yeah.
prototypical like
Yeah.
he's
His
just
greatest crime is that he had allergies.
yeah
He's a loser.
yeah and I think that movie works so well that you like you don't think that hard about Walter unless you take the time. Like, of course, you're on board for the main romance instead. And he's of course, because this other guy is always the nicest guy in the world. He's unfailingly gracious about it, and you have to believe he was on to find someone.
Yeah.
And if this movie plays out to its logical conclusion, like he's such a sweetie.
Mhm.
But I do think there's at least a little more thoughtfulness about those tropes. I think there's a little more interior life for these characters that could be vessels. I think partially just because they've gotten made fun of so much. Like
Mhm.
a pretty underseen movie that I think is pretty interesting is The Baxter, the Michael
Yeah, I
Showalter.
never heard of that one.
Oh, check it out. It's interesting.
Yeah,
It's
I'll have to check it.
it's very indie, so like I don't want to set the bar too high, but the whole premise of it is it opens with your classic rom-com ending where dude runs in and she's at the altar and he steals her away and it's all happy, and then Showalter is the guy who got left at the altar who's like, oh, like what do I do now? And they
Yeah.
call that trope the Baxter in that film. And so it's I just a little more thoughtfulness on that subject in general, I find really interesting.
Yeah. That is interesting. I definitely will have to check that out.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
I like it.
I think my favorite is probably, I do love A Fake Fiance. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think Friends to Lovers, it can be frustrating because there's like, how stupid are these people? Like, how
Right.
can they not know that this
That's the
person
one
is in
that
love
can
with
trip me up a
them?
little bit.
Like,
Yeah.
what? But I
Right.
do love it.
Yeah.
I mean, I love them all, but
Yeah. When done well, of course, because that's the other thing. Like I've seen incredible and frustrating examples of every rom-com trope under the sun, like any
yeah.
fan of the genre has. So like, yeah.
hmm if you had to pick one leading lady and one man as the best of all time in the genre, who would you pick?
That is an impossible question. But I sort of love it. Okay, let me spitball a little bit. Like, can I play like fantasy rom-com here where I can like pretend they existed at the same time?
Yeah.
So like I want to pair a lead and a leading actress who could never have been in a movie together, but like what if they had?
Right.
So like I don't know, what if like Cary Grant and Meg Ryan got to, like, how cool would that, like I think those energies could have been really interesting playing off each other, or I guess I'll just spin it, or we could do Tom Hanks and Katharine Hepburn. Like if we're gonna look at like the great, like their styles are so different, but I think it would be really cool to see like, flinty Katharine Hepburn going up against like affable Tom Hanks. Like I think I can't pick a favorite in of each because like the goals are so different.
Yeah.
Like how am I going to compare Cary Grant and Tom Hanks? Like they're both incredible. They're doing extremely different things in their films. But
Yeah.
like if I could mix and match history, that would be pretty cool.
Who do you think is like a modern Cary Grant? Do you think we have somebody?
People have thrown Clooney out as like a representative example of like very
see
slick and
that.
suave. I get it. I think Ryan Gosling can bring that. I think
Yeah,
certainly,
I can see
like in
that.
Crazy Stupid Love, he's kind of carrying that energy a little. But he's also like, Ryan Gosling's a little more laid back than that. Cary Grant can be so snappy. So I think Clooney's a little closer to the mark.
Yeah, and I think that Ryan Gosling's like a little bit more sincere.
Yeah.
Like I can't imagine Cary Grant doing the whole like jazz is amazing speech.
Right.
From La
Yeah.
La Land, like or something like that.
Yeah, Clooney makes more because he can also, I mean, he can be so witty and charming, but like he can play it like it's all a mask. And Cary Grant is very good at that.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you think is the key for the genre going forward to be successful? We've had Anybody But You.
I think Anyone But You makes me so happy. Like
I know.
It's been such a just such a good sign for the health of the genre, I think, to just watch a movie play like that and play with Gen Z. Like it just feels like it's doing all the stuff. And I think Will Gluck is like doing this really well. He kind of got lost in Peter Rabbit land for a little while, but if you just look at it, draw a straight line from Easy A to Friends with Benefits to this, like he really seems to be able to make these movies that like do traditional rom-com stuff, knowing but not like making fun of rom-com. Like I just think the tone is just,
I could see that.
Like, it feels modern. I think he's doing really good stuff. I think broadly for rom-coms, we're probably going to see slightly different goals between theatrical and streaming. If I were guessing where it's going, recent theatrical rom-coms have been like a little more high concept, maybe a genre blend, like stuff like The Lost City last year, where it's an action. It's basically Romancing the Stone, or even
Tickets to Paradise.
It's, that feels like it could have been more at home streaming, except like the stars are so big and it was shot in the most beautiful place you've ever seen.
And both of those did pretty good. So like,
they did. No, they were both hits, like in general.
Mm-hmm.
I think streaming's goals will continue to be a little different,
Mm-hmm.
a little smaller scale. The incentives just make sense on streaming.
Yeah.
Like, rom-coms are, I don't see them ever going away on streaming because it's a perfect place for that model in terms
Mm-hmm.
of, if you watched a few rom-coms on Netflix, then every time they drop one, which is pretty much every week, the algorithm will push it to the top of your feed, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
very great, like, it's a Friday night, long work week, open a bottle of wine, like, here's a star I
Mm-hmm.
like, here's a premise I like. It's just sort of, it'll always fit
Mm-hmm.
into that model. I'm more curious where theatrical is going, and I would
Mm-hmm.
say between Anyone But You overperforming, I hate that term because, like, who says it wasn't going to do that well? But you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Compared to what it was expected to do,
Mm-hmm.
it's done very well.
Yeah.
And No Hard Feelings, which is not a rom-com, but was kind of like in that sort of rom-com model, like the way it was
Mm-hmm.
marketed at the time it came out, like that was another kind of sleeper, and it's also done gangbusters on streaming. So I have to imagine, like, they got to be happy with that performance too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are signs that the genre is in a healthy place right now, and
Yeah.
I'm very heartened by it because I want to keep seeing these movies.
Yeah. Last year was like the year for the bittersweet romance. So it's gonna be interesting to see what happens kind of with that. Your past lives being the kind of the ultimate
Yep.
example. But I felt like, especially at festivals, practically every movie I saw was a bittersweet romance. And so,
And to be fair, you're going to see more of those at festivals in general.
yeah.
That's the tone for a festival rom-com.
But I think it'll be interesting to see how Hollywood bumps off of Barbie, because it's not a rom-com, but of course they're going to learn a bunch of the wrong lessons. We're going to get a bunch of toy movies, and that's
already on the way.
Yeah, very frustrating.
Very
But my hope is that it will instill some confidence in movies for women, that we can make movies for women, and that they can be successful. And not just movies for women, but movies that are overtly for women with, feminine, traditionally feminine attributes, which had been kind of, like you just almost never saw it, in Hollywood, even on Hallmark. Sometimes they would, sort of shy away from, we don't want to be too cheesy. We don't want to be too, and to have a movie that was just so overtly pink do so well made me very, very, very happy.
I'm super optimistic about. I mean, I shouldn't put too much faith in Hollywood to learn the right lessons from a success, because I mean, I literally documented in the book why times that didn't happen. But how do you ignore 1.6 billion worldwide and Best Picture and an event, like a cultural event? Like, it's just it has to be too big to ignore. I'm hopeful about that.
Yeah. Well, I'm just glad that we have film critics that respect the genre, because I do think there's a major genre bias against romantic comedies within the critical community, and it makes me crazy when you'll read a review that's like glowing, and it's like 2.5 stars. You're like, what? It doesn't even make sense.
No, I do think I like to think it's gotten better, and certainly there are more female critics working, which helps too.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, certainly than like in the 90s. But I do think the reflexive genre bias can be hard to shake. It really can. Like a lot of people, smart people, don't necessarily want to acknowledge how much they like the movies, or at least they don't want to be in the position where they're going Anyone But You or Oppenheimer. Like, they don't want to say those are two, I'm not saying that Anyone But You is a 4-star movie, but you know what I mean? Like, it's such an apples to oranges in some people's brains. And I would like to think that rom-coms can be judged for, how is When Harry Met Sally not a classic on a par with anything that came out in the 90s or 89? I always do this, but you know what I mean?
Right.
Like, it is a classic Hollywood film of that era that undeniably, in a way that I'd stack it up against any Best Picture from that decade.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, talking about the book. This was a lot of fun. I hope people check it out. We'll have an affiliate link down in the description. People can check it out. And thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had a blast. All right. Yeah, anytime.
like to thank Scott for coming on the podcast. This was so much fun to get to talk with him. I hope you all enjoyed it and you'll enjoy the book. And let us know what you thought about all the different things we talked about in the comment section or on Twitter. And you can find me at Rachel's Reviews, all of our social media, iTunes, YouTube, and on Rotten Tomatoes. Check that out. Also, make sure you're following the podcast, Hallmarkies Pod, Hallmarkies Podcast, all of our social media. And if you are listening on iTunes, please leave your ratings and reviews 5 stars. That really helps us a lot. And if you are watching on YouTube, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Really appreciate that. And check out our Patreon and merch store. And we'll talk to y'all later. Bye.